In the pitch dark of a rural log cabin, a heavy quilt is violently ripped from a bed. An invisible weight drops onto the mattress. A child is struck across the face by something no one can see. For the next 4 years, this unseen force will dismantle the Bell family piece by piece, culminating in the death of the man of the house. While sounding like a campfire legend, the Bell Witch haunting is a thoroughly documented case. Dozens of neighbors and officials provided sworn testimony, treating the violence not as myth, but a terrifyingly public fact. The events center on Red River in 1817. It was the edge of the frontier, a place where the deep, damp woods felt close and oppressive, and the nearest neighbor was often miles away. In this isolation, there was no authority to appeal to when the environment itself turned hostile. John Bell was the ultimate authority in this world. A wealthy, rigid farmer, he believed in things he could touch: his land, his stone fireplace, his heavy cast iron pans. He was a man built for the physical struggles of the frontier. John soon discovered that his status and physical strength were useless against a predator that occupied his home without occupying space. He was forced to watch his family suffer, realizing that his role as a protector was an illusion. The haunting began subtly, slipping into the mundane cracks of their daily routine. For months, the only signs of trouble were the small, quiet disruptions that barely registered during a busy day of farming. Then the anomalies grew bolder. The family dogs would stand at the tree line, teeth bared at empty shadows. Inside the cabin, a patient, rhythmic tapping started echoing from deep within the walls, sounding like fingers drumming on the logs from the inside. John relied on logic to keep his household calm. He attributed the sounds to rats in the walls, raccoons on the roof, or the natural groaning of green timber shrinking in the winter cold. But his children began hearing something more deliberate. They heard heavy, measured footsteps pacing the floorboards above their heads. Then came the sound of something massive being dragged across the dark storage rooms, as if an invisible resident were rearranging furniture in the middle of the night. John's refusal to acknowledge the supernatural offered no protection. It simply meant that when the entity finally dropped its facade and began to attack, the patriarch was completely unprepared for the violence that followed. The entity eventually moved from noise to physical assault, focusing its initial malice on 12-year-old Betsy. In the dead of night, she would wake to find the mattress sinking beside her under the weight of an invisible guest. The child was subjected to brutal violence. Invisible hands pulled her hair and slapped her face. These beatings were so sustained and vicious that Betsy was frequently found unconscious on the floor of her room. The terror became a community event. Neighbors would crowd into the Bell parlor, sitting in stunned silence as the entire cabin began to shake. They watched as the family's reality fractured while they stood by, unable to intervene. When the entity finally began to speak, its voice was full of specific personal hatred for John Bell. It mocked him by the name Old Jack, cursed him in front of his guests, and stated plainly that it intended to stay until he was dead. By focusing its most brutal attacks on his child, the entity broke John's spirit before it ever touched his body. His home had become a public stage where his inability to defend his family was on constant display. As the haunting entered its final phase, the entity withdrew its attention from the rest of the family and focused exclusively on John. He began to physically wither, separated from his community by a sickness no doctor could identify. The attacks became clinical. At the dinner table, the entity would paralyze John's jaw, locking his mouth shut so he couldn't swallow. He would sit for hours in front of his family, starving and exhausted, his face a mask of frozen terror. John grew gaunt as his body slowly began to shut down. In the final days, even the sounds of the farm seemed to die away, leaving a heavy silence in the cabin, broken only by his shallow, rattling breath and the steady ticking of the clock. This was a systematic execution. John was no longer a man being haunted. He was a man being dismantled in his own bed by a force that had calculated exactly how much he could endure before he broke. In December 1820, the deep winter isolation of the frontier was absolute. On a morning of profound silence, the family realized that John Bell would not be waking up. While checking the room, John's son found a physical piece of evidence left behind by the entity. Hidden in the medicine cabinet was a small vial containing a dark, unidentifiable liquid that no member of the household recognized. As they held the vial, a disembodied voice filled the room, laughing as it claimed credit for the murder. It told the grieving family that it had given old Jack a big dose of that liquid while he slept, and that it had finally fixed him. The family threw the vial into the fireplace, and the liquid erupted into a violent, unnatural blue flame. John Bell died that same afternoon, the victim of a spirit that had finally transitioned from noise to poison. The presence of the vial changed everything. The haunting had moved beyond psychological terror and manifested a physical substance that could be held, poured, and used to stop a man's heart. The legend of the Bell Witch often ends with the death of John Bell, but some local historians point to a theory involving a local schoolteacher. This perspective suggests the haunting wasn't the work of a wandering demon, but a calculated vendetta born from within the community. In this light, the entity becomes a weapon of local malice, a way for neighbors who hated the rigid, wealthy patriarch to carry out a death sentence under the cover of a supernatural event. At the funeral, the atmosphere was bleak and freezing. As the first thud of frozen earth hit John Bell's coffin, the mourners fell silent, but the woods did not. Witnesses reported hearing a voice echoing from the barren branches high above the open grave. It wasn't screaming or cursing. It was singing a rowdy, mocking drinking song that followed the coffin all the way into the ground. Whether it was a demonic presence or a human conspiracy, the malice in Red River achieved its goal. John Bell's strength and status meant nothing in the end. He was a man who lived by the physical world and was ultimately destroyed by something that didn't belong to it.